of related tweak characteristics and its application to Mantis 6. So first a short overview of this presentation. I'm going to give you some context and present this target cipher Mantis. Then I'm going to talk about the differential attack strategy that we are employing. And then I'm going a little bit deeper into the probability calculation for these clustered differentials. And at the end, I'm going to show you some experiments and the results of those experiments verifying our claims. So first, Mantis is a tweakable block cipher. And in contrast to these normal block ciphers, which have message and key input and produce a ciphertext like AES and DES, the tweakable block ciphers also have this additional tweak input. And this tweak input can be used, for example, to give some context to this encryption. And the very well-known use case is, for example, memory encryption, where the tweak can be essentially set to the address of this memory. And so it can help us, for example, break determinism during the encryption process. And we can also use this tweak to then build more advanced modes of encryption. Whereas with traditional block ciphers, we always have to build some kind of mode of operation around it to, for example, get rid of this determinism. So for examples of these tweakable block ciphers include Skinny, Mantis, and Karma. And one way to construct such tweakable block ciphers is actually called the Tweaky framework. And this Tweaky framework is essentially an SPN network at the bottom where we have this round function that gets iterated many times. And we additionally have this tweaky schedule, which takes the tweak input and the key, and then has some linear functions that produce a tweak key, a round tweak key for each round, which then gets added to the current state in the encryption. And this framework has some very interesting properties. So most of the time, this tweak schedule is actually linear, and the attacker, which is useful for our attacks, can actually control the tweak and use these properties for related tweak attacks. So this gives the attacker essentially much more freedom and can improve existing attacks. And we are going to focus on differential cryptanalysis. So differential cryptanalysis, we are looking at the differential trail where we are looking at an input difference between two message pairs in the message input and a differential trail which with some probability results in an output difference in some state. And then we can, for example, guess the last round key, calculate back and verify that our resulting state actually corresponds with this trail. And using this probability calculation, we can then eliminate wrong key guesses. And we can also do this in the context of tweakable block ciphers, where we then can also use this freedom that we have in the tweak to introduce more differences and cancel out differences during this differential trail. So let's talk about Mantis. So Mantis was introduced at Crypto 2016, and it's a tweakable block cipher that also tries to have the goal to have a very low latency. And there are two official variants, Mantis 5 with 12 rounds and Mantis 7 with 16 rounds. And in addition to also using this tweaky framework, Mantis is also a reflective cipher, where we have this alpha reflection property that we can use the same circuit for encryption and decryption. And this also has some properties that we can use that induce symmetry on both sides of essentially this encryption process. So Mantis, the round function of Mantis has these very lightweight operations. The 4-bit involutive S-box, which is taken from Midori. We have the add key and add constant steps. We have a very fast permutation of the state cells. And we also have a very lightweight near MDS matrix for the mixed column step. And we also have this tweak schedule, which is used in the tweaky schedule to permute the current state of the tweak. So now I'm going to present this attack strategy where we allow input difference in the message and in the tweak, and essentially use the freedom that we get by also allowing differences in the tweak state to improve the differential characteristics. And this strategy was already applied to Mantis 5 at FSE 2017. So if we look at this picture of Mantis, it has the whole Mantis 5, it has the whole essentially 14 rounds. And here we can see a differential trail where we fix a specific difference per state cell. So each of those state cells represents a nibble, and this red color essentially means that we allow a single fixed state difference for this differential trail here. And if we look at this concrete trail, this has a differential characteristic with a probability of 2 to the minus 72. And that's essentially almost optimal for Mantis 5, but still not that good, so we can't use this trail directly to build a differential attack. So if we go to the other direction and allow every possible tweak, every possible difference, we arrive at essentially a truncated differential characteristic where we only care about if the state cell is active or not, so if there is a difference or if both cells are the same in each message. So this, of course, means that the S-box transition works with probability 1, but then we have some other constraints, like, for example, in the mixed column step. And overall, the probability that a given message pair with this truncated input difference follows this truncated differential characteristics is also about 2 to the minus 100, so also not that great. So one of the ideas was to kind of mix this process and restrict, first of all, the input difference or the difference in the tweak, which we as an attacker can freely choose. And if we fix this tweak difference to a single value, we can then propagate these constraints induced by this single difference to other state cells. And this looks somewhat like this. So we have much more colors, and these colors, as I said, essentially represent how many different differences are allowed in this state cell. And as we can see, this cluster of differentials, as we call it, has a much higher probability than both the single differential characteristics and the whole evaluation of this truncated differential characteristics, where we see this cluster actually has a probability of about 2 to the minus 39. And then, using some clever matching of message pairs at the input phase, we can actually generate enough message pairs that we expect one of these pairs to follow this characteristic. And we can do that with essentially much lower data complexity. So to generate a single pair following this cluster, we need about 2 to the 25 chosen message pairs. So this attack strategy for Mantis 5 is very practical and was even concretely implemented and took one single hour on a standard laptop to recover the secret key for Mantis 5. So by hand. And this is one of the areas that we are trying to improve. So how can we find these clusters more automatically, and how can we then evaluate the probability of these differential clusters? So if we look at a short example, so if we have a single differential characteristics, it's very easy to calculate the success probability of this single characteristic, because we just go to the difference distribution table and look at the possible transition probabilities from, for example, this S-box step to the next S-box step, and also can verify that based on the properties of this mixed columns layer, that this transition holds with probability 1, and that the S-box transitions here in our case hold with probability 2 to the minus 4 each. But if we now allow more than a single difference per cell, this picture gets a little bit different. So here the green set essentially denotes all of the differences that are reachable in one evaluation of the S-box from this starting input difference A. And from this difference of A, we can actually reach 4 other differences in the DDT, and these are A, F, D, and 5. And if we allow all of those, of course, this transition probability for the first S-box step actually becomes 1. But then, because we now have multiple allowed differences in the green cells, we actually lose some probability in the mixed column step, so that this transition actually works again. So for this specific transitions in the mixed column step to work, this probability needs to be, this works with probability of 2 to the minus 2. And we have this constraint that actually these two input cells need to have the same input difference for this transition to work. And then later we have this case where we want to go back from essentially a state where we have multiple difference to a single difference, and then there's this question, okay, how do we actually calculate this probability? And if we allow more than one state difference in this last state here, how do we calculate such a probability? And the previous approach was to compute this transition probability based on the DDT and the actual sets that are allowed here. So as I said, for a single input difference mapping to all its possible output difference, this probability is of course 1. But then for mapping this set of AFD5 to another set of AFD5, we essentially go to the DDT and sum up and multiply the probabilities for each possible transition. So we look at the probability that A transitions to A, and A to F, and A to D, and so on. And we essentially account for all of these probability transitions. So here we can see that in the case of where we go from this set of AFD5 allowed differences to the same set, this probability is actually 2 to the minus 1. And if we allow these differences and these multiple states, this essentially improves the overall probability of this differential trail by a lot. And so this was the way this was computed back in the FSE 2017 paper. And then during the experiments and during the actual implementation of this attack, then we noticed that the concrete probability of these experiments actually doesn't correspond that well to this probability. And in practice, it was actually more successful, the attack. So it was even more pairs than expected followed our differential cluster. And this was actually by more than a factor of 2. And so one thing that we assumed here was that we always have a uniform distribution of these allowed differences. And of course, if we take care and actually try to verify this, that this is actually not the case for most of our states. So what we did was we extended this calculation with some probability distribution vectors. And here we can see, for example, that if we start with a uniform distribution of, okay, all of our possible differences are A, and then based on the difference distribution table, we move to a state where we have also a uniform distribution of these 4 differences. But then in the next step, we actually see that A is much more likely to map to these 4 differences than the other 3. And so we get a skewed distribution. And this continues throughout these S-box layers. And actually then we can try to more accurately calculate this probability and see that we actually, in this second part here, get a much better probability for our cluster, because this transition probability is now much higher because of this weighted vector where we have much more appearances of the difference A. So we then took this, this improved probability calculation and automated the whole process by a tool chain. So first of all, we search for a promising truncated characteristic, and we do that via a MILP model, but you can also do that using, for example, a SAT solver. And then we fix a promising tweak difference, and then we propagate our constraints throughout the cipher. And we do that cell-wise for the S-box step, the key addition, and the permeate cells layer. And we do that column-wise for the mixed columns. And then we, at the end, calculate the probability and the data complexity automatically. And because it's automated by a tool chain, we can now look at much more of these differential clusters. And we had a whole bunch of them, and then we found a promising one that actually allowed us to attack more rounds of Mantis. And this tool is actually public, so if you want, you can go to GitHub and play around with it if you feel the need. So, as I said, we had a look at a whole bunch of clusters, and then we found one for Mantis 6, which allowed us to mount a key recovery attack on Mantis 6. And here you can see some part of this cluster. And one nice feature of this tool is it actually also produces these pretty pictures for you. So the average probability of this cluster, so the probability that a message pair that conforms to these input differences follows this cluster and conforms to the output difference, is about 2 to the minus 67.7. And again, using this matching of this careful matching of chosen input messages, we can get the data complexity again down to about 2 to the 46.7 per solution. So the overall attack complexity for this key recovery attack uses 2 to the 55.1 data complexity and about 2 to the 55.5 time complexity, and which gives us a data time product of 2 to the 110. And this is much lower than the general data time product for an attack of about 2 to the 126. So this key recovery attack is actually not that trivial, because we have to do this in multiple phases, where we first guess some parts of the first round key and apply some filter, guess parts of the last round key and apply some filter, then take this combined information and guess some bits of combined round keys 2 and 11, and apply another filter, and then we store all of these key guesses and intersect key guesses from multiple iterations. And the detailed process for this key recovery attack can be found in the paper. So, and another nice feature is that we actually use this probability calculation also to calculate the probability of our filter, so that we can more accurately predict how many wrong key guesses will be filtered by during this key recovery attack. And we do that by essentially using the same methodology and computing backward, starting from the ciphertext. So we actually did a lot of experiments on this to verify that this attack is actually practical. This attack actually works with this complexity, and that the probability that we calculated for this differential cluster is actually pretty accurate. So as we can see here, this is some experiments that try to verify this probability of these characteristics. And we did that for random keys and fixed keys. And we can see that essentially our experiments follow the theoretical estimate very closely. So all three lines are essentially on top of each other. And at the end, we are getting into a very low sample space, because these probabilities, of course, get very small, so we had to do a lot of iterations to get pairs that follow this trail up until this point. And we essentially verified this using an equivalent of 2 to the 55 message pairs. And I said an equivalent because, of course, 2 to the 55 message pairs is quite a lot. But in the paper, we describe a method where we can deterministically essentially skip the first S-box layer and save a factor of about 2 to the 10. So we only needed to produce 2 to the 45 message pairs, which was actually doable. And we verified this characteristic up until about round 10, where the number of solutions following this characteristic was actually quite low. So about 6, these are these empty points at the end. And we also verified that our attack method described in the paper has a good success probability. And essentially one important property for our attack is that each of our iterations has actually at least one message pair that follows this characteristic. And we also verified that this happens. And we can see that we verified this at the mixed columns layer of round 9, where you can see the green line actually follows the expected distribution, which would be a binomial distribution, very closely. For the inner rounds, for example, if we go back to round 5, this is actually not the case, that each of these iterations would have at least one conforming message pair, because at this point, the solutions are very essentially clustered together. So we have several iterations where we have lots of solutions, and we have several iterations where we don't have any solutions. But this essentially evens out over the whole cipher. So for the later rounds, we can see that this approaches the binomial distribution quite nicely. So we're pretty sure that our approach does actually work, and based on this, we then calculated the success probability of the attack, and therefore then the concrete parameters for the data complexity and time complexity. Okay, so let's come to a conclusion. So we presented again these clustered related tweak differentials and the general method to find and evaluate these clusters of differentials. And we also presented this improved probability calculation for these clusters of differentials. Using this and the automatic tool chain, we found then a cluster for Mantis 6 and essentially used it to mount a key recovery attack. And we also did extensive experiments to verify the validity of this attack and methods. Thank you for your attention, and if there are any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
So do you have any questions?
Yeah, in fact, that's awesome.
So do you have an idea on where this, how this method works? Not how, why this method works, especially on Mantis, like what are the criteria so that it's working?
Yeah, so this, we also try to apply it on other ciphers, and it works essentially very well for Mantis because of this interplay between the concrete S-box and the linear layer. So essentially the S-box has this property where we have high probability sets that map to each other, and the linear layer is actually so lightweight that we can more easily propagate these sets without actually changing them throughout this throughout the cipher. So essentially an interplay between the linear layer, the concrete linear layer, and the concrete S-box that is used in Mantis, which work very well together for this attack.
Okay, especially in with regard to the remarks you just made about the interaction of S-box layer and the linear layer, have you tried to apply these results to karma?
Yeah, we have actually tried to apply these results to karma, and we've also observed some clustering effects for karma, but they are not as severe as for Mantis, and we have found some trails, but not some clusters, but not high probability clusters that allow a key recovery attack.
So which version could you attack?
So
Karma 4, Karma 5?
Karma 4 is easily possible, yes, if you allow the full data and time complexity. And for Karma 5, it's we didn't manage to mount an attack with the full data and time complexity. So we have a differential cluster, but the probability is not high enough to mount these attacks.
Thank you.
I think Christopher has a question.
Okay. Thanks for the nice talk. You mentioned that the practical evaluation of the Mantis 5 attack, it turns out that the attack is actually better than expected.
Yeah, so it's essentially better than expected because in the 2017 paper, the previous method for this probability calculation was used. So essentially the probability of the cluster was estimated to be lower than it actually is in practice. So if we apply this new probability calculation to the old cluster, we get essentially this factor of 2 that we observed in the practical attack back, and it more closely corresponds to the concrete attack.
Okay. Because in the old paper, I remember that the data complexity was slightly higher than...
Yeah, we also, in the old attack, we also changed the way we generate these initial structures to also combat these clustering effects that we observed in the final picture. Because for less rounds, we then often have iterations where we have multiple pairs following the characteristic and more iterations where no pair will follow the characteristic. So it's not essentially not that uniformly distributed over all possible over all iterations. So for this Mantis 5 attack, we tried to combat that by essentially taking different starting points, taking more different starting points for this initial message generation phase.
Okay, thank you.
So let's thank the speaker again. The next talk is about related tweak statistical saturation cryptanalysis and its application to karma. And the authors are Muxiao Li, Kai Ho, and Meichin Wang. And Muxiao is going to give the talk.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. I'm honored to have the chance to present my paper on this special occasion. The title of my paper is Related Tweak Statistical Saturation Cryptanalysis and its Application on Karma. This paper is a joint work with Kai Hu and my supervisor, Meichin Wang. Previous statistical saturation attacks proposed by Collard and Standard are all implemented under single key setting, and there is no public attack model under related key or related tweak setting. In our paper, we proposed a new cryptanalytic method, which is called related key or related tweak statistical saturation attack. And we have proved that distinguishers used in this new method are conditional equivalent with those utilized in the key or tweak difference invariant bias technique. Hereafter, we will call the key or tweak difference invariant bias technique as KDIB or TTIB technique for short. And then an automatic searching algorithm for KDIB or TTIB distinguishers is also proposed. At last, we mounted the related tweak statistical saturation and TTIB attacks on reduced round karma. At first, let me briefly recall the KDIB technique in KRT19 ciphers proposed by Bogdanov et al. The definition of KRT19 block ciphers was proposed by Demon and Wyman in the AS book. As we can see, each round key I is XORed into the state at the end of round I, and a round key 0 is also XORed into the state before the first round. We use key to denote this column vector, where each round key I is derived from the mask key kappa. epsilon theta I minus 1 theta I denotes the bias around the I, and the bias of the linear trio theta on the kappa is epsilon theta kappa, which can be denoted as this equation. And then the bias of linear hole gamma lambda under kappa is epsilon kappa, which can be denoted as this. From this equation, we have the following conclusion. If this equation holds for all linear trio theta with epsilon theta not equal to 0 in the linear hole, then biases under these two keys are equal to each other, and this is called KDIB condition in our paper. With this KDIB condition, we can give the definition of a KDIB distinguisher. A KDIB distinguisher contains many linear holes as well as a fixed key difference delta, but it can be called as a KDIB distinguisher only when there exists a pair of keys such that their difference is delta and they satisfy the KDIB condition for each linear hole. For tweak alternative ciphers, we can give a similar attack method, which is called TDIB attack in our paper. TDIB is similar with KDIB since tweak has the same effect on the bias of linear hole with key for tweak alternating ciphers. Therefore, we have the following conclusion that if TDIB condition holds, these two bases are equal to each other. Now let me introduce our new proposed method, related tweak statistical saturation cryptanalysis. Assume the block size of the target cipher is n. In the statistical saturation cryptanalysis, one fixes a part of plaintext bits, which means these R bits are fixed, and then he or she takes all possible values for the other S bits. After obtaining the cipher texts, he or she considers the distribution of a part of the cipher text value, which means he or she will check the value distribution of these T bits. In our new proposed method, we also fixes a part of a plaintext bits and checks all possible values for the other plaintext bits. But we encrypt this plaintext under related key or related tweak pairs. After obtaining these two sets of ciphertexts, we compare value distributions of these two parts. In this method, the adversary can encrypt these plaintexts under different key or tweak pairs as long as they have same difference data. Besides, we also found that related key or related tweak statistical saturation distinguishers are conditional equivalent with KDIB or TDIB distinguishers. Since we will apply this method on the tweakable block cipher camera, we will only introduce the conditional equivalence between related tweak statistical saturation distinguisher and TDIB distinguisher. For the other conditional equivalent property, we will omit it since it has nothing different with this one. Before giving the conditional equivalent property, we make a decomposition of the target cipher. Denote the target cipher with n-bit block and k-bit tweak as H. And then we split the input into two parts, X, Y. The R bit X is the part fixed in our attack, and the S bit Y is the part taking all possible values. The output of H is also divided into two parts, H1, H2, and we only focus on the value distribution of H1. Besides, we also define a function Ti, where Ti is actually the function H1 when X equals to the constant value I. With this decomposition, we can give the following theorem. Let gamma lambda be the linear hole of H, with gamma separated into two parts. The first part is the R bit gamma in, and the mask values on the other S bits is 0. the output mask lambda is also divided into two parts. Lambda out is a t-bit value and it cannot be 0. Under this condition, when given a fixed difference delta, we have the following conclusion. If the bias is invariant under related tweak pairs for all possible mask pairs gamma in lambda out, then these two TI values will have same value distribution, and vice versa. This means same bias implies same value distribution, and same value distribution implies same bias. Given an R1 round distinguisher, we can mount key recovery attacks by adding R2 rounds after it. At first, we chose a set of plaintext P where X is fixed to BI and Y takes all possible values. And then we can obtain these two sets of ciphertexts by encrypting this plaintext under these two tweaks. And then we guess corresponding key bits to obtain these two TI values. If they have same value distribution, the guessed key bits are taken as red key bits, otherwise they will be discarded. The probability to reject red key is 0, and the probability to accept a wrong key fulfills this equation. This equation implies that the probability is sufficiently small. In practice, when finding a related tweak or related key, statistical saturation distinguisher directly is extremely hard, but KDIB or TDIB distinguisher can be easily discovered. Hence, we can first find a KDIB or TDIB distinguisher, and then we convert it into related key or related tweak statistical saturation distinguisher by following the way introduced in the conditional equivalent property. Now, let me introduce how to search for KDIB distinguishers with STP for K-Alter19 ciphers. The other searching algorithm for TDIB distinguishers is similar with this one, thus we omit it. STP is a decision procedure to confirm whether there is a solution to a set of equations. So our job here is to build some equations. From previous KDIB attacks, distinguishers were derived at word level for linear masks and bit level for key difference. Hence, in our searching algorithm, we focus on word level mask propagation property in the round function and bit level difference propagation properties for the key schedule. In practice, when aiming at finding R-round KDIB distinguishers, we always have to describe mask propagation properties from two sets, and their meeting point should have same active pattern. Our whole algorithm can be divided into 4 parts. The first part describes the word-level mask propagation properties. For the substitution operation, the active state of output mask theta out equals to the active state of input mask theta in. For the XOR operation, denotes active states of these two input masks as theta in 1 and theta in 2 respectively, and the corresponding active states of output mask theta out equals to theta in 1 equals to theta in 2. When describing word-level mask propagation property of 3-branch operation, we always have to decide decide mask active state of one of these 3 branches according to mask active states of the other 2 branches. Assume that we have known mask active states of these 2 branches, denoted as theta 1 and theta 2 respectively. Then the mask active state of the other branch, theta 3, will equal to 1 if theta 1 equals to 1 or theta 2 equals to 1. The theta variables being 1 means that this word is potentially active or definitely active. The linear layer can often be represented as a matrix multiplication to specify its word-level mask propagation property, we have to introduce the definition of deterministic pattern. Let the column vector m in, m out respectively denote the column-wise mask active states of input and output of m. Then the pair m in, m out is called to be a deterministic pattern if m out is unique given m in. And we use set G to record these deterministic patterns. With this set G, we have the following conclusion. If the column-wise active state of input theta in belongs to this set G, then the column-wise active state of output mask theta out will equal to the corresponding m out. Otherwise, all words of the output will be potentially active, which means theta out equals to this equation, this vector. The first part is used to depict bit-level difference propagation properties for the substitution operation. Let DDT represents its differential distribution table, and dirt in, dirt out respectively denote the input and output differences. If the corresponding propagation probability is p, then we have this equation, and p cannot be 0. For the XOR operation, the output difference dot out equals to the XOR value of these two input differences. For the three-branch operation, these three differences will equal to each other. Part 3 describes the KDIB condition. Given an R-round linear hole theta 0, theta r, and the difference on key, we have the following KDIB condition, which is this equation holds for all possible linear truths with epsilon theta not equal to 0 in this linear hole. Since theta variables are 1-bit values and dart variables are specific differences, we have to rephrase this KDIB condition into word level, which means if this word is active, then the corresponding k difference should be 0. Otherwise, we will have no restriction on its difference. The last part, part 4, describes some necessary restrictions. In order to exclude trivial solutions, we have to require that at least one round key difference is non-zero. Besides, equations describing the active state of input and output masks are also included in this part. For ciphers containing S-box in their key schedule, equations restricting the total propagation probability are included in this part. Combining all these four parts and then input these equations into STP, we can obtain KDIB conditions. Now we will apply our new Cryptanalysis method and our searching algorithm on Karma. Karma is a tweakable block cipher, and this is its structure. It supports two kinds of block sizes, 64 and 128, denoted by Karma 64 and Karma 128. The key size is 2 times n, which is separated into two parts, W0 key 0 with same length, and the tweak size is n bit. Karma 64 has 60 rounds and Karma 128 has 24 rounds. Utilizing our searching algorithm, we can obtain 7 different TDIB distinguishers for both versions, and this is one of them for Karma 64. In this distinguisher, these two input masks should have same mask value as well as these two output masks. Since we will only add several rounds after the distinguisher when mounting related tweak statistical saturation checks, the first round of the distinguisher should be a reduced round. Hence, these two input masks can take all possible values, but these two output masks should have same value. Since the output mask cannot take all possible values, we have to introduce the following theorem to obtain invariant value distribution property. Theorem 3 tells us that if the output mask satisfies the restriction that these two mask values should be the same, then we have the following conclusion. If we fix these two words into a fixed value I and takes all possible values for y, then the XOR value of these two words will have same value distribution with the XOR value of these two words. Utilizing this 8-round related Twig statistical saturation distinguishers, we can mount key recovery attacks on 10-round camera 64, and this is our result. This attack is the longest attack result considering out-whitening key. Besides, we also mounted TDIB attacks on 11-round camera 128, and this is also the best result considering out-whitening key in terms of numbers of rounds. My report is finished. Thanks for your attention.
Do you have any questions? If not, I have one. Did you try to apply it to any other cipher, or is there any specific reason to apply to Karma only?
Well, we didn't apply this technique to other ciphers. And I think there is no specific reason for to attack Karma. I just read the document of Karma and applied this method. Thank you.
Let's thank the speaker again. The next talk is about zero correlation attacks on tweakable block ciphers with linear tweak key expansion, authored by Ralph Ankele, Christoph Dobronik, Django Iran Lambui, Gregor Leander, and Yosuke Todo. And Ralph is going to give the talk.
Thanks for the introduction. So this is on zero correlation attacks of tweakable block ciphers with linear tweak expansion. And let me start with a quick introduction. So tweakable block ciphers, as we all know, compared to normal regular block ciphers, add an additional tweak value. And the tweak value doesn't have to be secure, so it's a publicly available value. But it also gives the attacker then the freedom to choose the value and use it in an attack. And the goal is to move the randomization from protocol level to block cipher level using this tweak. So, how can we construct tweakable block ciphers? So we can construct tweakable block ciphers by using modes, for example, ASGCM. But there are also some dedicated tweakable block ciphers, like Skinny, Mantis, Karma, and Deoxys. And most of them are built with this tweak key framework introduced in 2014. And basically, it's key alternating block cipher like this down there. But we also have a tweak schedule where we update the tweaks. So our contributions, so we analyze several tweakable block ciphers. For Karma and Mantis, we count instead of counting the rounds, we count the number of S boxes that we can attack. So we have an attack for Karma for 12 S box applications, for Mantis also for 12. And for Skinny, we can attack 20 rounds for Skinny 64-128, and for Skinny 64-192, we can attack 23 rounds. And for example, it's also interesting that comparing it to impossible differential attacks where the bigger attack actually improves about impossible differential attacks. So this is my overview of the talk. So I will give some preliminaries, then I will explain the zero correlation attacks on tweakable block ciphers, and then I will show some applications to Karma, Mantis, and Skinny. So first a short reminder about how differences in linear masks are propagated in a cipher. So over an XOR, the differences A and B just sum up. But an interesting part for tweakable block ciphers is when the differences are the same, because then they cancel out. Over an branching point, they are the same, and over an S-box, we just can compute the differential distribution table, and then it holds with a certain probability. And for linear masks, it's slightly different. So over an XOR, the masks are the same. Over a branching point, they again sum up, and over an S-box, we can compute the linear distribution table. So when we evaluate the security of tweakable block ciphers, for differential cryptanalysis, what we can do is basically we can the difference in the tweak and the difference in the state, and then we can cancel the difference in the first round if they are the same, and basically we get 1 round for free. If we look at the same thing in linear cryptanalysis, it was shown in FSE 2017 that the tweak doesn't introduce new linear characteristics, so that trick doesn't work. But what was also hinted in that paper already was that the tweak adds additional restrictions which can then be used in zero correlation attacks. So zero correlation attacks were first introduced by Bogdanov and Ryman, and basically it says that for 2 given masks, alpha and beta, it exploits correlation of exactly 0. One of the drawbacks of zero correlation attacks is that it normally requires a huge data complexity. And what you can see down there is basically the zero correlation attack on 4-round AS. So what we do is we have some active masks in the beginning. We go with probability 1. We do the same from the bottom, and we see that it doesn't match in the middle, and it has a zero correlation. So then, how can we do that for tweakable block ciphers? So for tweakable block ciphers, let's start with a very basic 2-round tweakable block cipher. So what we can do again, so over the first XOR, the masks have to be the same, and also from the other side. And when we then shift the masks into the tweak key schedule, we see that over the branching points, they all have to sum up, and yeah, they just give some additional restrictions in the tweak key schedule. And what we do in our attacks, we also link the zero correlation attacks later to integral attacks to reduce the data complexity. So in our attack, we basically take a lot of ciphers from the tweak key framework. So the tweak key framework is, the rationale was to treat the tweak and the key the same way. Therefore, it's called tweak key. It's basically completely linear, and it generalizes the class of key alternating ciphers. And it's a framework that can be used to design tweakable block ciphers. Some instantiation of that is the SDK construction. So instead of just one line with the tweak key, you can have several tweak key lines. And so it uses a state update function H, which is a permutation, which is applied to each of the tweak keywords. And further, there's also a multiplication that is different for each tweak keyword. And then we have a sub-tweak key extraction function, G, which just XORs the tweak keywords together. And there are also some round-dependent constants added for slide attacks. And the G function basically reduces many tweak keywords to 1. And the overall goal was to reduce the implementation overhead and also to simplify the security analysis. So let me shortly introduce a small toy cipher to explain the attacks better. So the round function is the same as AES, so it just has add key, then SBox application, then shift rows, and then a mixed column application. And for the tweak schedule, we simply just use the permutation of Skinny and nothing else. And also compared to Skinny, we extract the whole key and not just the first two rows. So if we look now on serial correlation attacks of the SDK construction with just one tweak keyword, do is we fix an input mask, tweak mask also to 0, we get a zero correlation. How does this look like? So in our toy cipher that I showed previously, so compared to the 4-round attack on AES, if we have the same round function, but now with a tweak schedule, and we do that attack, we can get a 5-round attack, and basically we shift the property of the zero correlation from the state into the tweak schedule, and what we can see is that on the left here, on the right here, there is just one active value, and all of the other ones are 0, and if we force the tweak mask to be 0, then we get a zero correlation. If we want to apply that to some ciphers with more tweak key lines, we can basically do a similar thing. What we do is we just have to compute the gamma sequence for all of these tweak key lines, and then we get a zero correlation. We again fix the input and output masks, we calculate everything, and then we can obtain a zero correlation when at most p linear active values are in there, and the p is the number of line key. So if it's tk2, then we have 2 active, and so on. So how does that look again on our toy cipher? So we have now 2 tweak key lines, and we can have 2 active values in there, and we can extend the attack to a 6-round attack. So our first application then is Karma. As it was already introduced before, so Karma looks like this. It's a tweakable block cipher based on the tweak key framework. It's a refraction-like cipher. So the middle part is this reflector. It has some extra rounds in there that are just keyed, but not the tweak is added. And then it just iterates the same round functions in the beginning and to the front. And so it uses a very lightweight involuntary 4-bit SBox. It uses the cell permutation of Midori. The mixed column matrix look like this. So it's basically a circulant matrix that's just repeated. And the tweak key schedule consists of a permutation H and the bit-based LSFR. So if we construct a distinguisher for Karma, what we can see, so we basically just fix some input masks and an output mask. We iterate that as many rounds as we can get, and then we look in the tweak schedule, and what we can see is there's just one active value in here, and yeah, we can then, what we do is we later translate this serial correlation distinguisher to an integral distinguisher to reduce the data complexity, and also move it then to related tweak key attack. In our key recovery, we basically can prepend 1 round and append 3 rounds. And what we can see is that in the round after the distinguisher, we have 2 balanced bytes. And we prepend 1 round and append 3 rounds. We have this X0 and X8 balanced at the same time. And to calculate both values. We use the meet in the middle technique for integral attacks, so we can evaluate the values independently. And for the attack, we use the FFT key recovery technique, and the time complexity is then about 2 to the 66, where we recover 56 bits of the outer keys and 28 bits of the inner key. The data complexity sums then up to 2 to the 48.4, and the memory complexity is 2 to the 53. So for more details, please check in the paper. So then we also applied the same attack for Mantis. Mantis is quite similar to Karma. It's also a tweakable block cipher based on the Tweaky framework, and it's a reflection cipher. So as a comparison between Mantis and Karma, so the run function looks slightly different. So the S-box in Mantis is applied first, and then there's the key is added. And for Karma, the key is added first, and the S-box is at the end. And also the S-boxes are different, and the linear layers are different, but they have the same structure. And because our attack is generic enough, so it doesn't exploit the S-box, we can reiterate the round function and basically apply the same attack. So the same attack that holds for Karma is then also for Mantis. Then let me show the attack to Skinny. So Skinny is also a tweakable block cipher from the Tweaky framework. It's similar round functions to AES, so it has a S-box application. Then the tweak is added just to the first 2 rows, so just the 2 rows of the tweak extracted and then added to the state. The shift rows is similar as in AES, and for the mixed columns, it uses a binary matrix. And in the tweak key schedule, there's application of a permutation and then an LFSR on the top 2 rows. Again, it uses a very lightweight 4-bit S-box. It uses AS-like shift rows, but it shifts to the right instead of left. And the binary matrix like this here is applied for mixed column. For the tweak key schedule, the permutation is used like this one here, and there's an bit-based LSFR that is added to the top 2 rows, but only in a setting for 2 and TK3. So with just one tweak key line, there is no LSFR added. So for attacks, so we can attack rounds of Skinny 64-128 in the TK2 setting, where we use an 13-round distinguisher, which has a data complexity of 2 to the 56 plaintext, and we use 2 to the 8 related tweaks. And for the larger version of Skinny in the TK3 setting, we use again 2 to the 56 plaintext and then 2 to the 12 related tweak keys. So that's the key recovery for Skinny 6128. So basically, we can prepend 1 round and append 6 rounds, and again the values set 14 in the 14th round at the 11th position is then balanced. And what we do is we just see how many state and tweak values are included, and then we can recover parts of the key. And one interesting observation is that the FFT key recovery method is not as sufficient, and the reason for that is that just the 2 topmost rows of the tweak key are added. So therefore we saw that the partial sum technique is actually more efficient, and we can get more rounds for the attack. And the data time complexity is around 2 to the 97. Data complexity is 2 to the 68, and the memory complexity is 2 to the 82. So for the attack on DK3, what we do is we can prepend 1 round again, and this time append 8 rounds. And this time 2 values in the state are balanced at the same time. And again, we use the meet in the middle technique for integral attacks to evaluate them independently, similar as for karma. And yeah, again, the partial sum technique is more efficient than the FFT key recovery technique. And the time complexity is 2 to the 155, and the data complexity is 2 to the 73, and with a memory complexity of 138. So in conclusions, what we show is a new attack technique for analyzing tweakable block ciphers. We have currently the best attack for karma in comparison of number of rounds or icebox applications. So an interesting thing is that the attack is independent of the keyed middle rounds. So if karma would add even more keyed rounds in the middle, we could just simply ignore them. And for Mantis and for Skinny, we add some further insights. Thank you.
So we have a lot of time for questions. So. Yes, we have a lot of time.
So first, I want to give credit to my colleagues. It's karma that looks like Mantis, and not Mantis like karma. Second, you just mentioned that the complexity on Mantis is the same, but are there any optimizations that actually use the simpler linear layer, or really it's a pure truncated approach, say the rotation to play no role at all?
Mm-hmm. So our attack is quite generic, so we don't use something from the S-box, so it can be just any 4-bit S-box. We also don't really exploit the linear layer, so and the linear layer is basically the same from the number of ones and zeros in the matrix. So the attack, the only thing we had to do is reshuffle the round function, but that again results in the same thing. And yeah, so the attack just simply applies the same. So just our attack, most probably other attacks are completely different.
I know these are great insights. Thank you.
Any more questions? If not, I'm just curious that can you actually apply it to non-linear key scheduling, or is there any reason that you chose only the linear key expansion?
Yeah, most probably you can, but then the calculating of the mask is most probably a lot more difficult.
So the issue is only the complexity part, or
so most probably it's just how the gamma sequence is calculated. Most probably is slightly different, but we haven't checked. I'm not sure.
Thanks. Let's thank the speaker again. The last talk of the session is about cryptanalysis of round-reduced Skinny. The authors are Sadeghi, Tara Mohammadi, and Nasur Bagheri, but the authors couldn't be here, none of them, so Hadi is going to present the paper.
Thanks for introduction. So as already mentioned, one of the other wanted to come, but for some unexpected reason, unfortunately, she couldn't come, and then very recently I was asked to present the paper. So actually we Skyped in the airport when I was coming, so I hope that I can cover all of the details. But anyway, this presentation is about cryptanalysis of Skinny. So first, I'll introduce a brief description of Skinny, and then I'll present a new zero correlation linear cryptanalysis of Skinny, which is obviously the best zero correlation characteristic that has been found for Skinny, and then I discuss MILP model for Skinny 64 and the searching related to a key, and finally I conclude with the results. So yeah, it's good to be the last talk. A lot of things have been introduced by previous talks, but Skinny was introduced at Crypto 16. It has different variants based on the length of the block and also the length of the tweak. We have different variant that that N denotes the block size, and T is the tweak size, and T can be N, twice N, and 3N, and respectively we call them TK1, TK2, and TK3 version of Skinny. And two main versions is when N is 16 and 128, the block size. So of course, as usual, we can like AES like Cipher, we can present the whole state as 4 times 4 square. It has each round has 5 operations. It consists of 5 operations. First, we have boxes applied, and then we have add round key, and then tweak key are added here in the first 2 rounds, and then we have Shifro like AES, and we have a mixed column that is a simple XOR between the cells. And the tweak actually the tweak key is updated like this. We have a permutation each time it passes the permutation, and then add to the first 2 rows. And if the TK, and if we have the TK2, we have also LFSR. It means that first we apply permutation, and then the first 2 rounds also pass an LFSR. For TK1, when the size of the tweak and the size of the block size are equal, then we don't have LFSR. Okay, zero correlation linear is already introduced by previous work. So we have a linear approximation like this, and then for the linear approximation, of course, we can consider the probability. It means that the probability that this term would be equal to 0, and then the correlation is twice of the probability minus 1. And if the correlation would be exactly 0 for a cipher, then we have a distinguisher for the cipher. For Skinny, we can simply find the non-zero zero correlation characteristic. It's depicted here. If we have, for example, one cell active here, it means non-zero mask for the input and another non-zero mask just for this cell. Then we can simply that it's not possible, because in the middle, for example, if we look at the first cell here and here, from one direction, it should be 0. The mask, the internal value of the mask should be 0, while here it should be non-zero. So it means that we have a zero correlation characteristic for 9 rounds. It's very straightforward to obtain this characteristic. But if you want to add one more round, for example, we want to add from backward or forward in the middle of the cipher to have 10 rounds zero correlation, then we can see that there is no contradiction. So if we compare this assay to this assay, there is no contradiction between them at first glance. And what is done in this paper that the others have observed that if we consider these 2 cells, and they should be 0 mask, they should have 0 mask. And if we go to the details of the rounds, then we see that, okay, if we don't want to have a contradiction, then they should be. And after the Shifro, they are in the same mixed column, and after applying mixed column, then this cell should be a non-zero value. And if we compare this state to this state or this state, then we can see there is a contradiction. So by this nice trick, we can extend zero correlation, well-known zero correlation for skinny for one round. And then the authors utilize this zero correlation characteristics to apply key recovery attack on skinny for different versions. And they could actually attack 14 and 18 rounds for these versions. In what follows, I focus on impossible related to key impossible differential. First, let me recall the using MILP model for finding impossible differential characteristics. So at 2011 by Moha and others, it's shown that the problem of finding optimal differential characteristic or linear approximation, linear trail can be actually converted to the optimization problem model in MILP. And in MILP, we have a set of inequality, and also we have a function that we want to have find the solution such that this function get the minimum value. So how we can model finding impossible differential by MILP? So it's simple. We should consider all of the bits in the before the S box and after the S box. So we present the states, the bits of the states before the S box by xi0 to xi63, and similarly the output as yi0 to yi16. And we denote each bit as 0 or 1 if there is no difference in between them and between the states on that bit, and 1 if it has difference. To describe the active or passive S boxes, we need to consider another value like AJ for any S box. So we have 4-bit to 4-bit S boxes. And if the S box is active, it's 1, and otherwise it's 0. And to describe this like MILP in a MILP model, then we have these equations, and then we want to have our aim is to find the solution for the minimum of the value of this summation. And then what, as usual, it is done. They consider differential distribution table and all of the values that this probability is larger than 0. It means that delta x can go over this box to delta y. And then, of course, we can consider, instead of considering the whole space, they actually compute the representation of convex hull with SageMath. And with respect to XOR, it's already well known that it can be modeled by this equation by using another one more actually variable like D, and A plus B plus C should be equal to 2D. And it's a description of A XOR B to C. And of course, we have some kind of impossible events. For example, A, B, C cannot be 0, 0, 1, because 0 XOR to 0 is not 1. Okay, this model, for the first time, I think it was proposed by Sui to use MILP model to find impossible differential characteristic or zero linear trail. But it was applicable on just small boxes with a small size. And then in follow-up work, Sasaki and others propose another method that also includes applying, it can be applicable on boxes, larger boxes like 8 times 8. The technique is to consider input and output differences fixed, and MILP search whether or not there are propagation from input to output difference, and if it's not possible, it's invisible, then it concludes that it's an impossible characteristics. So the authors applied the technique on skinny by considering different scenario. We can consider input value, or after the S box, we can consider this state. Of course, we should take into account the tweak key, and we have also output. And the results are shown in this table. So the best result for skinny TK1 is for 13 rounds, and for TK2 is 15 rounds by considering these differences. Based on the results that I just showed, they could find characteristic which is 1 round larger than all of the well-known previous works in impossible setting. And then it's used to actually, yeah, it's, for example, it's the picture of the characteristics that they have found for 13 rounds of skinny and N. We have a contradiction in the middle, and it's and also, but yeah, so maybe the color is not very clear here, so they consider a fixed value here and fixed value here, and they show that for 13 rounds, over 13 rounds, it's impossible. For 15 rounds, it's a bit more complicated. Actually, they consider these states, and what they found is that a bit complicated. So M, N, P, Q cannot be any value. It should be actually holds in these equations to have an impossible characteristics. And all of the values are listed here. It means that totally we have 15 different impossible characteristics, but when you fix the input difference, then the output difference cannot be anything on that very specific value. And for key recovery, we have some problem that I will discuss later. I will say what they did, but then this 15 rounds used to attack to 23 rounds skinny and 2. So for key recovery, as usual, we have a nice framework. We have impossible differential in the middle, and we add some rounds in the beginning and some rounds at the end, and then we guess the involved key in the last round and the beginning round, and then based on the number of actually the probability of the filtration, and from the end and beginning we can compute the time complexity of the attack. But what I mentioned, that the 15 rounds impossible differential characteristics that has been used is very specific. It means that if you have specific value in the input of the characteristics, then the output is very specific value. So totally 15 different values. So from forward and backward, what they did is that instead of doing this in 15 different parallel methods, they consider general structure, and finally they, whenever they reach to this state like this, then they save this value for the guess key. And then finally they can compare and do the same for the backward, and then compare when for which specific values they have impossible event, and then they can of course eliminate the wrong key. So yeah, this is the results for key recovery. If you look at the results, the time complexity the time complexity is slightly better than previous known attacks, but the memory is notably decreased. So from 2 to the 124, it's decreased to 78, which is notably less than previous one, and also from here, 56, it's decreased to 49. And if I can find, yeah, here, then 112 is decreased to 97. So the memory is decreased notably. Yeah, sorry again if I didn't go to all of the details. Actually, I didn't have enough time to prepare myself, but thank you anyway for your attention.
So I guess you'll be willing to answer questions, or?
Yeah, at least I can try.
Okay, sure. Question? Okay. So let's thank the speaker again and enjoy your coffee.
So good morning, welcome to this session dedicated to the design and implementation of S boxes. So we have 3 talks in the session. The first talk is on partitions in the S box of Trebog and Kuzniewczyk, and it's given by Léo Perrin.
Bit of a spoiler
Starts
here.
By the conclusion.
Yes. So this thing works. Yes, it does. Okay, thank you for the introduction. So, in fiction, in the 1960s, there was a James Bond episode Russia with Love, a very appropriate title. And even better, in the core of the scenario was about trying to recover a lecter. A lecter was a, well, Soviet at the time, not Russian, encryption device. There's a scene where you have James Bond who is listening to a description of this device. It uses routers and everything, all this old-fashioned stuff. And you have these guys from MI5 or 6, I never remember. And they are trying to use this information to recover how this lecter works. Reality is a bit less impressive. Instead of sending guys overseas and have them listen to pretty KGB agents, you look at a PDF file. And on this PDF file, you have this kind of stuff. So you just look at them and you squint for several months, and eventually, hopefully, you get some results. This is Pi, the S-box of the last two Russian standards. So you have a block cipher called Kuznechik, which means grasshopper, and a hash function called Stribog. Both use the same S-box. It operates on 8 bits, it's a permutation, its differential and linear properties are fine. They're a bit better than what you would expect from a random permutation on 8 bits. But what we don't know is how it was made. The only thing you need to implement an S-box is its lookup table, and that's the only information that its designers provided. This obviously begs the question of how did they design it. So first, I'm going to give a brief reminder about the things we knew about this S-box up to that point. So some results which I have established with my then colleagues from Luxembourg, and also the tiny bits of information provided by the designers. And then I'm going to present what I claim to be its actual structure, so the one which its designers used on purpose. And finally, I will explain why I don't like that structure. So in the first place, we found this decomposition of pi. So that's when I was in Luxembourg. I worked on this with Alex Biryukov and Alexei Udovenko. And we managed, using techniques I'm not going to go into, to rewrite the permutation in this way. It's ugly. Let's not beat around the bush. It is very ugly, but it helps with the hardware implementation. So when we ended up with this first decomposition, we were mostly puzzled. Also because this component has the worst differential uniformity you could imagine. This part, I call it T, this part I call it U, so in the following, when I talk about the TU decomposition, it's this decomposition. We were not very happy with this decomposition, so we made a bit of a detour. We had a look at an S-box from Belarus and realized that it was built like a logarithm and that it actually looked a lot like the Russian one. And we also established that the Russian one could actually be written like a kind of logarithm, a discrete logarithm, composed with a weird function, a weird permutation, which is extremely weak from a cryptographic standpoint, so it's not something you would expect from a random permutation. But it's really not satisfactory. We knew there was something to be found, but we couldn't find it. So this we published at TOSC also. And in this TOSC paper, we wrote this in our conclusion. So the important parts are in red. We think it more likely that each of these decompositions, so the TU decomposition and the log-based one, is a consequence of a strong algebraic structure. Still, this master decomposition, from which the other would be consequences, remains elusive. And at that time, we thought the only way we could actually recover this decomposition would be if the designers of these algorithms, so basically the Russian Secret Service, would tell us. The little information they did provide, because they are trying to convince people to standardize these algorithms. So Stribog is already an ISO standard. Kuznechik is being considered for standardization by ISO. Both of them are RFCs. So their designers do try to advertise them. And in one of such talk, you have one of the designers of Kuznechik, which explained how they built their S-box. So here you have two successive slides. It's the same, except the second box is in red, which I think means that it's the important part. It's about how they built their S-box. The first box here and here is about a possible way of building S-boxes by selecting them from known classes This gives you the best cryptographic properties, so differential uniformity, linearity. It has an obvious analytical structure, and you can use, for instance, the finite field inversion, which is indeed a perfectly valid way of building your S boxes. That's how they are made in the AES. The second box, which turns into red, is about a random search with a given limit on the parameters. It's not clear to me what this limit might be. And such S boxes do not have optimal properties. They don't have the best differential and linear properties, but they also do not have a pronounced analytical structure, which again is true, and people do use such S boxes for such reasons. So there is nothing wrong here. The part which I personally find quite funny is that they left out the first option because it has an obvious analytical structure, and preferred the second one because it does not have a pronounced analytical structure. Well, actually, what I'm going to show is that it has an extremely pronounced analytical structure. Cryptographers have tried to discuss with the designers because they go to conferences sometimes. So Markku Juhani Saarinen, he and his co-author for WorldBob, which was a Cipher candidate based on Stribog, they had a session with the designers of these algorithms, and the designers said that they had used some randomization using various building blocks, and that this was seen as an effective countermeasure against yet unknown attacks, which is coherent with the content of the previous slide. At ISO, what they say is that they did not use the TU decomposition to design their algorithm, their S-box, which I think is true, that their aim was to have the best possible the best possible differential and linear properties obtained from some random search, which they do not explain. And they also say that before the SHA-3 competition, we didn't really care about the origin of parameters, and so the Stribog designers didn't care either. And so they don't feel too bad about the fact that they lost the generation algorithm. So at that point, they claim to have lost the generation algorithm, and that they don't really mind because at the time when they designed it, people didn't really care about the origin of parameters. This is not true. Even in 1985, people were already designing block ciphers with very careful explanations about their generation process for their S-boxes. So I'm a bit puzzled by this statement. And then at a small workshop called Crossfire, there was a Russian cryptographer that presented Kuznicek. Unfortunately for them, Maria was the session chair and could ask them some questions about their design process. And they avoided the question and eventually said that they had used the TU decomposition to design their S-box, which, no, they didn't, I think. So at that point, we have two decompositions which we are not really happy with, and we have some contradictory statements by the designers, and also some really wild statement by the designers, like this is, well, I'm supposed to be polite. So now I'm going to present what I found and what I described in this task paper, which is what I think is the actual structure. So before I go into how I found it, just a bit of math. The finite field with 2 to the 2m elements, so there should be only one m, but a 2 before, can be written in this way, except for 0. So that's just the finite field logarithm. And because of this, you can partition the state in this way. So you take the union for all i's of alpha to the power I, where alpha is the generator of the multiplicative subgroup. This is the multiplication. And then if you put aside the case I equal to 0, which is just the subfield, then you get this description of the finite field as a union of vector spaces. But not quite vector spaces, because these don't contain 0, but almost vector spaces. Since the subfield is a vector space of dimension m in a finite field of dimension 2m, you can find another subspace of the same dimension such that the union of the two will span the whole state. So you can also write the finite field this way. So it's going to be the union for all these w's of the additive coset of the field, of the subfield. And then if you put aside the case where you have the element 0 here, you end up with this partition of the state, of the finite field. What's important is that in both cases, you have partitions with an element, with a set of size 2 to the m, and 2 to the m sets of size 2 to the m-1, and everything is linear. It's important because that the pi interacts with this partition. First, some words about how I actually found this structure. So for reasons that are completely unrelated to any of this, I worked on an algorithm which looks for vector spaces in a set of elements. And one nice application of this algorithm is that it can allow you to look for spaces of a given dimension that go through a permutation and are mapped to other spaces. So you have an affine space in the input, and when you apply the permutation, you have an affine space in the output. And you can look for all of those. So I was very happy because I thought I had a nice way to test this algorithm, because I knew that in pi there was one such transition. If you set this branch to 0, this is a multiplexer which selects the output of this component when this one is equal to 0, and this one otherwise. So basically, you have that when you takes all possible values, here you get a vector space of dimension 4, and here a vector space of dimension 4. So I was expecting to find one such transition. But actually, I found 2. So I had completely forgotten about this S-box, and I had moved on with my life, but I shouldn't have, and now I was back working on pi again. And so what I realized is that this second pattern was, could be generalized to look not at really spaces, but almost spaces where you have removed the 0. So if you fix a value here, when this guy takes all possible values except 0, you get a vector space at the top, because the multiplication by a constant is, and a vector space at the bottom, well, an affine space at the bottom. And you have 16 such weird transitions. So this is the situation. We have the finite field, the image of the finite field, which is the finite field itself, and you have one vector space, which is sent to some affine space, and another vector space, which is sent to another affine space. So that's what I had found with my algorithm. And the combination of these two spaces together, they span the whole finite field, and you have the same here. When I realized this, I felt really stupid, because I had been looking at pi for 3 years at that point, and I knew about like this set and this set, that they existed and interacted with the S-box. And I never realized that they were the subfield. So when I realized that, I banged my head on the wall, and then worked further. And then I realized that this other vector space in the input was a multiplicative coset of the subfield, and in the output you had something which was in direct sum with the subfield. And when you look at the other multiplicative subsets of the other multiplicative cosets of the subfield and the additive cosets of the subfield in the output, pi maps one to the other. So pi maps the partition field into its multiplicative cosets of the subfield to its partition into additive cosets of the subfield. The random S-box pi does this. Actually, you can write it in this way. So that's what I call the TK log, because the designers of Kuznicik are the TK26, and it's kind of a logarithm. So you need an affine function and a small permutation of the exponents of the subfield and the generator, and then it works like this. I'm not going to go into too much details. It always, so such permutations, and pi in particular, always satisfy some set equalities, namely these. But what is important is that it has a kind of separation property. So if you have that your input is in a given multiplicative coset, it will always be in the same additive coset, because when you change j here, you change the j here, and so where it only changes where you are in this set. The additive coset doesn't change. At the same time, if you fix j and you change the multiplicative coset, you will be at the same spot in the additive coset. You will just change the additive coset. If S depended on I somehow, you would still have this coset to coset property. It's not the case. So pi does not just map these multiplicative cosets to additive cosets. It's even simpler. It could do this in a more complicated way. It doesn't. Also, we can prove, and I'm not going to go over that, that this TK log structure explains both of the previous decompositions. the relationship between the TU decomposition and this log-based decomposition was extremely unclear to us. We were really puzzled by this thing. This decomposition explains it. Now, why don't I like this? I'm going to have to tell you about the work of someone else, namely Arnaud Bagnier. My apologies. The space into affine spaces, subspaces, to a partition of the space into affine subspaces. And if you write it with boxes, like I always do, and always with a T and a U, this is what you need. So if you want to build a backdoor of this specific type, then you need a this box which looks like this. And in particular, if you write it formally, what it means is that you need to have a nest box which maps additive cosets of a subspace to additive cosets of a subspace. So that's what he established. So yeah, what he established is that the S-box has to map additive cosets to additive cosets. That's not what we have here. Pi maps multiplicative cosets to additive cosets. But it's not that simple either. Because when you look specifically at Stribog, the linear layer interacts with both additive cosets and multiplicative cosets of the subfield. So that's something else the designers did not explain. When they designed Stribog, they have a small internal block cipher, and this internal block cipher uses a mixed column-like operation. And it's specified by its binary matrix. So this is the specification. If you write the binary matrix as a picture, this is what you get. And there are some obvious patterns here. It's actually just an 8x8 matrix of the subfield. Why they didn't say so, I don't know, because there is nothing wrong with that. What's funnier is that it's defined in the same field with the same polynomial as pi. So if you take a vector of this shape, you just have one element, x, which is in the subfield, and everything else is equal to 0. When you apply this binary matrix to the vector, you get elements that are going to iterate through multiplicative cosets of the subfield. So if x is in the subfield and is going looping over the subfield, each cell of the output vector after multiplication by this matrix are going to iterate over multiplicative cosets of the subfield. So two open problems, pretty obvious ones. First, how was L built? It's MDS, but what else can we say? I mean, like this guy is equal to this guy, and this guy is equal to this guy. Can this tell us what kind of structure it has? And obviously, can we leverage these properties to actually attack Stribog? Sorry, or or also Kuznicik. So in the case of Kuznicik, you also have a similar situation, except they were kind enough to actually provide the matrix in this case, and it's a different polynomial that defines the field. So you don't have this kind of stuff in Kuznicik. But you still have the same S-box with the same very strong algebraic structure, which is supposed to be random. So some natural questions that you may ask yourselves after seeing this. That's one I get asked a lot, actually. Isn't it always possible to find a decomposition of a permutation? Well, the answer is simple, it's no. If you generate a permutation at random and you give it to me, I won't be able to say anything other than that it looks random. If we can actually find a structure, it's really a strong indication that the design process was not random. Is there anything wrong with log-based S-boxes because other people use them? There's nothing wrong with using a logarithm, but that's not what's happening here. It's not just a logarithm. It's a logarithm which maps the field to itself, not to the integers. It can be seen as the composition of a logarithm and then something which sends back the integers over the finite field. And also in the case of Stribog, it interacts in a very non-trivial way with the linear layer. So that's why I don't like it. And why would, I mean, this is the third decomposition we have. Like, why won't there be a fourth or a fifth one at some point? To answer this one, I need to do some combinatorics. So you have 2 to the 1,684, roughly, 8-bit permutations. You have 2 to the 83 TK logs. And to put this number into perspective, you have about 2 to the 70 affine permutations. So if someone were to give you an affine permutation and tell you that they had generated it using a random permutation generator, you would probably not believe them and believe that there is some sort of bias into their generation algorithm. It's the same here. That's why I claim that the presence of this structure was deliberate, and that's what the designers actually intended. If you want to design an S-box with properties that are really similar to pi, the generation algorithm is very simple. You just pick a TK log at random. You check if its linearity and differential uniformity are the best possible for a TK log. If it's the case, then you're happy. If not, you generate another. It finishes pretty quickly. You just need to generate about 2 to the power 11 random TK logs, and you will find one. However, the result of such an algorithm will really look like pi. However, it's never better than a regular logarithm. So if you just take a plain discrete log, the differential uniformity and linearity will be the same, and you will actually have fewer of these coefficients in the DDT-LAT. So it's an epsilon better. Pi is an epsilon worse than a discrete log. So the reason to use a TK log instead of a logarithm is not an improvement of the cryptographic properties. And so in conclusion, so if you want to convince your friends that, if you want to talk about the decomposition of this S-box with your friends who might not be cryptographers, I have written a note where I intended to vulgarize this result. So it's at this address. I claim that the TK log structure in pi, and I hope I have convinced you, was a deliberate choice by its designers. That's what they intended to do. Why, I don't know, but that's what they intended to do. And it really looks like a structure which is known to yield a backdoor. I have not found an attack against Trebog using this property. To be clear, I have not found such an attack. I'm not saying there is none. I have not found it. However, until the designers of Trebog and Kuznicki explained properly how their random generation process could output an S-box mapping cosets of the subfield to cosets of the subfield in the same field as the one used to build the linear layer of their hash function, and why that might be a good thing, I don't think we should use these algorithms, and I don't think we should standardize them. I'm looking at ISO when I'm saying this, like representatives of ISO. I know that next week they're going to discuss standardizing Kuznicki. I think it's a horrible idea. Thank you.
Questions or comments? Yes. Here, Pierre.
Do you think there's something to learn about invariance, more variants of invariant subspace attacks exploiting these kind of properties?
If I were to try to exploit these properties, that's the way I would go, yes. It's really reminiscent of these invariant properties.
But this kind of partition is typically, it doesn't remind me of any of the, for instance, of the attacks that Gregor presented on Monday, so that it might be a new variant or...
Yes.
Okay.
That's the way I see it. Yeah. Eh bien, je sais pas non plus.
Thank you for your talk. You indicated that it's easy to find the one with the best differential linear properties in this space. How did you find the bound for this?
Experimentally. Maybe there is a way to really obtain them with proper pencil paper argument. I didn't do that. I generated a lot, and I saw that they could not improve the bounds. Actually, I have my experimental results here. This is not just the differential uniformity and linearity, it's a bit finer grained. So the higher you get on this axis, the higher you go, the least likely your linear properties are, and in particular, the lower your linearity is, the higher you go. It's a bit finer grained because it also counts the number of occurrences of this maximum coefficient. And here is the same for the differential uniformity. So when you generate TK logs, you usually end up in here, under my pointer here, and you have some cases where, which correspond to about 1/1000th of them, which end up around this spot. But you would need to go much higher than this to get something with a lower linearity, and much further to get something with a lower differential uniformity. So maybe there is like one specific combination of these two components, so the S and the kappa that you need to define the TK log. Maybe there is one specific instance which will lower these quantities, but using just random algorithm, a randomized search, you're not going to find them.
Any other question or comment? Okay, if not, let's thank Leo again. The next talk is on lightweight and side-channel secure 4-bit S boxes from cellular automata rules. The paper is by Ashrujit Ghoshal, Rajat Sadhukan, Sikar Patranabis, Nilanjar Datta, Stjepan Picek, and Debdeep Mukhopadhyay. And will give the talk.
Thanks for the introduction. So, in this talk, we are going to discuss on lightweight side-channel secure 4x4 S-box design used from cellular automata rules. So, the first thing that motivated us to for this work is the NIST lightweight competition requirement and the resource and to provide a solution for the resource-constrained devices for IoTs. So for lightweight block ciphers, the common matrices that we use from cost perspective are area, memory, or energy consumption, and from performance perspective is throughput and power consumption. Now, most of these matrices are orthogonal to each other. Suppose if you increase area, then your throughput will be better, but if you make a better throughput, your area might degrade. So for our work, we focused on area, as the lightweight competition requires that it has to be a low cost, and side channel resistance is a necessary for the application. So coming to some lightweight block ciphers, we have a present or gift or Midori, where which follows a linear layer, which is very lightweight, that follows bit permutation or almost MDS and shuffle cells. For SCA countermeasures, linear layer is much more cheaper, but while it comes to nonlinear layer for S boxes, it becomes heavy, especially for making it side channel resistant. So side channel countermeasures requires a dedicated design where we try to address this issue in our work. So our goal is to design this 4x4 S boxes with side channel resistance using cellular automata. So what we have done is we have used a cellular automata rule with focus on area, and with those rules we tried to classify based on the number of cubic, quadratic, or linear terms in the ANF, and using that we have seen that we have footprint with those S boxes 49% and 35%, and it consumes lesser power compared to present or gift S boxes. Now, following this, we designed two design paradigms with these S boxes, one with bit permutation and another with almost MDS matrices. At the end, we will show those results as well. So before going to the details, let me give you some background. So first thing is we call an S box optimal, which follows bijective property with nonlinearity 4 and differential uniformity 4. Then for side channel countermeasures, we randomize the intermediate values and using secret sharing scheme. So we followed a threshold implementation scheme for our SBox side channel resistant design. So proposed by Nikova. So this is a countermeasure against the differential power attack. So this is also based on a secret sharing scheme and secure multi-party computation, which has correctness, non-completeness, and uniformity property. So let's take an example. So I have taken an example of an AND gate which has 2 inputs. So we are sharing the X, Y input into 4 shares, and we will get output also as 4 shares, and we have 4 output functions to be implemented in different modules to get the final output. So this particular example, all these 3 properties, so correctness, non-completeness, and uniformity. So if you do an XOR sum of all the outputs, you will fulfill these 3 properties. Okay. Next is cellular automata. Now, cellular automata is a local rule, is a function which consists of grid of cells. Each cell has some finite set of states, and the state of each cell is dependent on some neighborhood of its cells. So for our function, for our SBox design, we use a rule, a function iterated over 4 clock cycles to get 4 outputs. So every cell, like for example, if our function is x1 to xn, every cell, you consider that there are n cells in the function, and each function, and if it depends on 4, suppose for example d number of neighboring cells, so x1 will be depending on the d number of neighboring cells. Similarly, all the cells will be dependent on its neighboring cells. So this is an example where we have taken n as 6 and we have taken d as 3. So if you see the first output, like the 1 in first output, this 1 is dependent on this 1, 0, 0 to give the output as 1. So now comes designing how we use this to design our SBoxes. So if we take 4 variable rules, we will get around 2 to the power 4 total rules, and we check the optimality. The optimality definition is according to the slide that I have discussed before. So according to that, there are 512 rules which are optimal. I mean, which SBoxes are optimal. So using that, we are cycling, we are permuting the input bits, and we are getting in 4 clock cycles the 4 output bits. Structure. So these are the classes that we have obtained, like 1, 2, 2, meaning 1 is the number of